Welcome to Shat on TV, American Gods, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the Star series American Gods. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, my gentle, sweet, blood-drinking fire bear, Ash Schlafly.
Hi, y'all.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back and offer our thoughts and research, plus the top listener voicemail and email for the week. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our sister podcast, Shat the Movies, at shatthemovies.com, and our Twitch stream at shatontv.com/Twitch. This week's edition is covering American Gods Season 3, Episode 4. Ash, we've been big fans so far this season through episodes 1, 2, and 3. What stood out to you about this episode?
It was kind of your typical mid-season show, right? Like a typical episode 4. I think that it definitely has continued to help to build momentum. I think it's continued to build the plot in a way that's keeping us engaged, that makes a lot of sense, that's continuing our character storylines. And also, I had talked last week about how much I liked the opening. This opening as well was, I thought, just really remarkably beautiful. I thought the visuals that they used with the cotton that grew up, and then from the branches, you had the individuals that were lynched, and then you had the other branches that were, kind of branched into the plantation homes. I thought all of that was really haunting, and I thought the imagery was super strong. And I just thought in general it was, maybe not as revolutionary to the series as last week, but just a really good, solid mid-season episode.
This Laura Sweeney montage that we saw, I never thought I would see the day where Laura Moon and Mad Sweeney montage made me emotional. They took 2 seasons of trash and turned it into a full minute that made me fall in love with their relationship. And I'm not saying I want them to get back together in some sort of a soap opera fashion, but I am saying that this montage almost made all the time we spent with them in the first 2 seasons worthwhile. And I think this is a testament to good editing. With good editing, you can take old footage, put some good music to it, cut it right, and it works. In addition to that, little touches that they did in this episode, like Odin using a burner phone to magically call Shadow anywhere, was that clever mix of old world and new that the novel is famous for, right? It's another way of showing that the show is finally exuding that spirit of the Neil Gaiman source material. This episode really gave us insights into the motivations of characters and even of our country. And I think that's something that the King Bee noted was lacking in prior seasons of American Gods. We were seeing the what, but we weren't seeing the why. And it starts, as you mentioned, with that amazing opening with the origins really of slavery in the United States and the United States itself. And we've seen slavery depicted in previous seasons of American Gods, most notably with Mr. Nancy aboard a slave ship that chose to burn and sink rather than deliver a pacified cargo of enslaved people. But that never gave us the context of motivation. That I would say is a problem with my education overall. As a kid, I was taught that we had slavery in America and there was oppression of people of color, but it was always because slave owners were mean. I think that attitude still carries over into today's America. People look at white supremacists and they go, oh, they're just crazy. Racists are just racist because. And it's ignoring that economic incentive to keep people oppressed. And to that end, they refer to the United States in this opening as the richest corporation in history. And I was like, man, are they being hyperbolic? But when you think about it, no. I mean, what is a corporation? The definition of a corporation is a legal entity with the rights of a person. And what can that person do? Well, they can enter contracts. They can loan and borrow money. They can sue and be sued. They can hire employees. They can own assets, and they can have taxes. That literally sounds like the Constitution of the United States in setting up our government, right? What does Congress do? Pretty much that. What does the executive branch do? Pretty much that. And so when you think about it, yeah, the United States is actually a corporation in a sense, and the richest in history? I'd say yes.
Well, I think that's interesting because you're talking about those founding documents. So the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, those are, our incorporation paperwork, right? That's what made us who we are. A lot of the research I did in my master's program was looking at corporations as bodies, right? As individuals and the way that they own different aspects of society. And I think that the true ownership here of people owning people and owning the labor and the rights to the production production that they made, which here they're alluding to the fact that it was, the cotton and the sugarcane that was being farmed on the plantations. I think that it's a really smart statement. And I think it's interesting looking at the old gods versus the new, right? The old gods were ruling in a time where this corporation existed, and the new gods are part of, literally, we see with Miss/Mr. World this week, they're part of these modern day corporations and these modern day institutions. And really, if we look at the way the 1% versus the 99%, like, it's just this natural extension that has happened over time. And I think that they're doing a really smart thing to explore the economic side of this alongside and juxtaposed from this racial conversation that they've begun this season, and about how that systemic racism can't be separated from that corporate environment. It looks different today, but it doesn't make it any less problematic. And it certainly doesn't make it any easier to navigate for people of color.
Right. Race and economics are inextricably linked, particularly in America. And they say that so wonderfully in this script here, where they say America betrayed its oath to the creator. Now, that's Mr. Ibis's voice talking. He is the historian of the series. And this is an interesting point, essentially saying that we were a nation born with the belief that God gave men the right to freedom and equality. I mean, it's right there in the founding paperwork. And yet, to make that dream possible with its debt and being a young country, America understood that the price to pay was, in fact, enslaving men, which is a direct violation of that reason for existence, right? But on a smaller scale, not just talking about the show itself and the country, let's talk about like individual characters. Shadow finds motivation in this episode. This entire time, we've kind of been looking at Shadow and going, he just does what people tell him. Now, suddenly, Ricky Whittle as Shadow is not letting Wednesday tell him what to do. He's not letting Lakeside tell him what to do. He's not letting Tech Boy tell him what to do. He's searching for Bilquis because he wants to. He wants answers and he wants to find her. And what I really loved about this episode is we finally got to see that power unleashed. This is a power in Shadow that we haven't seen before. He's throwing Tech Boy around, really coming into his own as this demigod. Ricky Whittle, as an actor, actually upstaged Bruce Langley in these scenes. We talked about how Tech Boy was, really coming into his own, really being a presence on screen. But Ricky Whittle, not only looking sexy, now he's looking tough. He's throwing Bruce Langley around, saying, "Thanks for lynching me, Peckerwood." I'm really liking this character.
Well, and this is totally a buddy cop movie that I would go and see, Shadow and Tech Boy, right? Because the way they're interacting with each other, like the brilliance of having him kind of glitch out in front of the guy that they're trying to get information from, all of that was really fun this episode.
Yeah.
I think their interactions, the pacing of it, all of it was just really, really smart. And Shadow is finally making smart decisions. I was so frustrated by so many of his choices in previous seasons where I'm just like, what? Where he became a character that was almost annoying at times because of how just silly and illogical his choices were. And this time it makes sense. And I think that's what's moving the plot so well.
And another character that I think we found annoying in the past, but you said in the last episode really started to become appealing, was Laura Moon. And right on time, she comes back in the picture. We wondered if she had dusted herself a la Buffy and would not be back. But in fact, she does return. And she's back in the picture demonstrating motivation, I think, more than anybody in the series right now. She was, remember, a husk of a human being. She couldn't feel warmth or hunger or anything else. And now she's brought back from purgatory. She's feeling hunger, she's feeling longing and other human needs. And what's really cool is she was that one note character driven strictly by the need to find that golden glow of Shadow Moon. That's all she could see and all she could drive herself toward. In a sense, a zombie. And now we see that she comes over that ridge thinking she's going to find Shadow. Instead, she finds a truck stop. I think her very existence is a metaphor for the spectrum of motivations that suddenly springs up in this episode, that all these characters are free to choose their own destinies and their own paths.
Well, and one character maybe that's not true for, I think, in this episode was Bilquis, right? She's definitely had the toughest road in this last episode. We get the answer because we kind of, we're guessing last episode of, is she dead? Did Tech Boy kill her? Did somebody else kill her? Is she just gone? Did she kill Tech Boy? We had lots of questions. And we find out that she's been captured, right? Like that she's being held in this terribly cold stone room. And I think there was such a beautiful scene. There hasn't been many times on American Gods because it's just kind of a fun show, which is fine. Like fun shows are fine, but it's not really spoken to me in a way that I felt like was super inspirational. And this week I found a lot of really, it was just a tremendous amount of depth in a lot of what they were trying to do with Bilquis's storyline. And we get to see her where she's at this really low point emotionally. And I don't know about Eugene, but I found it really heartbreaking to see her broken down like this. And she's constantly repeating that mantra, almost like an armor to protect her against the situation she's in, where she keeps saying that she's not alone, that she's not alone. And I found it really, really affecting to see her in that kind of weakened state.
And there's intent there in building her up earlier this season. We saw her at her peak, at power, where she was glamorous and powerful, and she had that amazing apartment and those amazing outfits, and she just looked great. And seeing her broken down like this, yeah, you're absolutely right. It was heartbreaking. And American Gods is asking a very interesting question here. Who do gods pray to when they're powerless? We see her, in this supplicant position. We see her kind of, bowing down almost as if she's doing her namaz. And Bilquis has this wonderful intersectionality that makes me wonder, who is she praying to? Is she praying to herself, or is she incorporating these beliefs of all these cultures that she, as the Queen of Sheba, is part of, right? Because if you look at Bilquis's history, she's in Christian history, she's in Jewish history, she's in Islamic history. When you think about all those histories, what's universal about all of them? Well, there's a belief in a higher power, and prayer and desperation are pretty universal. So there's an intelligence to using her identity to show it, and showing that, who is she praying to? Why is she praying? It doesn't really matter. It's about being desperate, about looking for anything that can get you out of your circumstances. And I love that they're taking these gods and making them multidimensional.
Well, and that comfort that their worshipers are seeking in them. We saw last week with the woman in the opening where her children are starving and she's seeking in desperation Demeter. We're seeing that over and over. I think it's a really interesting, like really meta question of who do gods pray to when gods are scared, right? If they're the gods. Yeah. I think it's really kind of fascinating. And in this episode, so she has this tear that strikes the ground, and Oshun arrives and shows her that she's not alone. And there's this awakening that happens, and Bilquis has this reconnection to not just who she is, but really who she's made up of. Like what is the fabric of her being. I read a really interesting interview with the actress who plays her, Yetide, and she basically says that this scene proves that Bilquis kind of like all women, that we distinctly are made up with the people who came before us. Because if you think about it like this, and the reason I'm saying women is, biological women are the ones who can produce life, like we grow life inside of us. And so as a woman, we give life only because life has been given to us. So it's like this weird cyclical thing. And the person that gave life to us, well, inherently someone had to give life to them, and so on and so forth, all the way back to the beginning of time. So me as a person, I am my mother, I am my grandmother, I'm my great-grandmother, all the way through my family tree. My DNA, it's marked by those people. And in a way, I'm made up of their essence because I carry their DNA inside of me. And the 30 trillion cells I have in my body are part them. And as a mom, I mentioned it this week on Chat the Movies, that what's so scary about having kids is like you throw your DNA out ahead of yourself and it just kind of continues on. And we see that here, that when you do that, your descendants, they exist both within us when we carry them, and then they exist through us, and they exist despite of us, beyond like our being around. And that's what we see. And like you talked about how in just a minute they had this whole exploration of commerce versus racism and how the two are intertwined in that intersectionality. In just this one scene, they explore all of that in this really complicated way that culminates in her dancing with her ancestors, because she is her ancestors. So when she's been begging not to be alone, she comes to this ultimate truth, which is that she can't be alone because she's not just one. She is the we from the beginning. And I thought that that was absolutely beautiful and such a highbrow, like super in-depth, really self-reflective thing for American gods to do. And I don't know how often they've done this. Like, it was really different for them to dive kind of so deep here, and in a good way. Like, I was very impressed by it.
Aside from that, there is a link between the Uribe people and Bilquis as well. So I mentioned that Bilquis shows up in, Christian history, Jewish history, Islamic history, also in Uribe history. Some of them do believe, certain tribes believe, that the Queen of Sheba was a Uribe noblewoman and responsible for serious infrastructure projects in ancient history. Now, archaeologists do say that the dates don't quite match up. Like, they're not saying it's impossible, but rather that it seems like they're, off by centuries. But you got to remember that with gods, it's more about belief than hard facts. So we have this continuity of identity, a very smart historic nod to the people connected to both Oshun and Bilquis.
Well, and the other thing that I wanted to talk about this week with Eugene is if we looked at Bilquis, the other big plot line here is Odin, right? And what happens with him. And I hope that this isn't total tinfoil territory. I don't think it is, because of the fact that it's at least grounded in some semblance of literature. But we get some FaceTime this week with Johann. He's been played by Marilyn Manson, which is always very strange for me for him to look normal. It's also very strange that he's blonde. It's slightly fun. And I know that there's a lot of controversy as we record this episode. It is the day that Evan Rachel Wood has made her big statement against him. But I did think it was interesting to see him in this role, something different than like Sons of Anarchy. And I know you're not a big fan, but I thought he was okay.
I like how you said he looks normal. I don't think he looked normal at all, but I get what you're saying. He's not in his Manson garb. And I'm sorry, but he has no idea how to glass someone with a bottle.
For argument's sake, neither do I. But I will say, so he talks here, he's speaking to Odin, and they're in this bar, and we found out that members of his band were killed last week through that news story. And so Odin is talking to him here, and he basically implies that it's a very real possibility, at least Odin believes so, that Johann killed his own bandmates, that he killed them in a rage. He keeps making these statements like, you have trouble controlling yourselves sometimes, you have issues with your anger, you fly into fits of rage. And I promise I'm not going way out on a limb here, so stick with me, y'all. But when I began to thinking about Norse mythology, I was curious of what we were seeing is that Johann is actually being set up to be one of the two werewolves that traveled with Odin throughout all of Odin's stories within all the literature that has ever been written about Odin as a god.
I mean, this doesn't sound crazy in the sense that the band all got killed, but Johann didn't. And Wednesday does refer to him as my gentle, sweet, blood-drinking fire bear, which I don't think we've ever heard him talk to anybody in that way. There does seem to be a kinship beyond he's just a human that worships me.
Yeah, and if you're not familiar with this aspect of Norse mythology, which I figure most of you aren't unless you're like just really into this kind of like random trivia. The idea here is that after the world was created by Odin, along with his brothers, Odin got really lonely. He didn't want to travel the world by himself anymore. So he did what all people do. He wanted to create some pets for himself. So he created these wolves, these werewolves. And the two most famous, the ones that traveled with him, were Gary and Freaky Wolf. They stand for the ravenous or the greedy one. That's what they translate to. And basically throughout the literature, Odin and these two guys, these two werewolves, were completely inseparable. They helped Odin find followers. They helped populate the world with the little werewolf offspring. That's how we get wolves, apparently. And I think that's, when you see him talking to Johann and we have this little nugget of maybe you killed them because you flew off into a rage, but we've got to make sure that we get as many followers as we can. And that's kind of part of his gig. It just all kind of connects. And then the last piece to this, which really might wrap it all up in an interesting bow later on in the series, is that Odin was eventually killed by wolves. It was a punishment for him breaking oaths. And considering what we're seeing here and how Johan acts in the bar toward Odin, maybe his character is going to be more important to the whole show's end game as things progress.
Yeah, I mean, he seemed pretty pissed off. He said that his god's throne was empty, and that voice coming out of him wasn't normal even for Marilyn Manson. I should point out that due to the accusations being leveled against Marilyn Manson, he will not be appearing in any future episodes of American Gods, at least for this season. That's an official statement from American Gods. So I really hope that they don't just cut this entire line short. Maybe they'll get a stand-in for him.
Just hire like Rob Zombie, like somebody else random to come in and act as Johan.
Spider zombie. And this scene with Marilyn Manson does end with the, Valhalla biker bar being blown up. You see Wednesday kind of disoriented, walking around outside, tears his clothes off, and is showing his wee-wee to the crowd. And he seems to be rambling about Pressed Rat and Warthog, which I immediately recognized off of Cream's best album. The lyrics were written by the drummer Ginger Baker, who is the second best rock drummer behind John Bonham, just got to say. But it is one of Cream's worst songs, in my opinion, off of one of their best albums. But you can easily find it on YouTube if you want to check it out. You don't have to go out and buy Cream vinyl, but you should.
Well, and there were a couple odds and ends, too, as always, that we kind of ID'd in the episode. The first one is for me. I was not on the first couple episodes this season. King B was. So I haven't gotten to drool over the fact that Dominique Jackson is in the show this season playing Miss World. I adore Dominique Jackson. She is like one of my many spirit animals, and she absolutely chews up every scene that she's in. She's on screen 3 minutes this episode, and I lived for every one of them. I am such a massive fan of the show Pose. All of you out there should immediately go and watch all of it. It is on Netflix. She is iconic on that show. She's a huge figure, a huge legend in the ballroom scene, the real legitimate ballroom scene. And she's this amazing actress. And I have to say, I really enjoyed her. I don't mind Crispin Glover. He's whatever, but he's absolutely nothing compared to her. And I hope that Mr. World very quickly gets transitioned back to Miss World for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I think Crispin Glover thought he was auditioning for Michael Jackson's Moonwalker or something. When this show was first announced, I was so excited about his casting. It was he's weird, he's otherworldly, it makes sense to have him in this show. Now I just feel bad for him. He feels so fucking out of place in this show and so outclassed by everybody else on screen.
Agreed.
For my odds and ends, I wanted to talk about the Orisha because we did give some attention to Oshun, but we saw 3 in this episode and we saw them in previous episodes as well. So just a quick touch on who they are. So these Orisha are spirits of guidance and of reverence. They represent different things. And depending on which texts or which cultures you refer to, there are hundreds of Orisha. Some are quoted as being 401 Orisha, or as many as you can imagine, plus one. But the 3 we see here are Oshun, who is divinity, femininity, fertility. She's the one that we see in the scene with Bilquis. Then in the opening scene, we also see her plus Yamoja, which is the Orisha of water, and Aye, which is the Orisha of earth. And finally, Ash mentioned that montage between Laura, Moon, and Sweeney at the top of the podcast. But I wanted to point out for anybody who didn't catch what was going on there about how Laura ended up back in the swing of things. Now, she went through purgatory and all that, but what we're seeing is Sweeney's body is decaying in this mausoleum. It's discovered by a child. They decide to clean it out. The blood from the body is washed down onto the floor. The man cleaning the mausoleum out also accidentally steps on the Gree bottle, and those two things mix. Now, if you remember, Baron Samedi said that the blood infused with love mixing with the Gree would unlock the power of resurrection, essentially. And so that is what brought Laura back. The body, the blood, the Gree all came together in a really smart way, and the coin was reintroduced as well. The writing was all over the walls for us, but we didn't quite piece it together as how Laura was going to get back in to the show. And I think they answered it in a really smart way. And now, Ash, it is time to get to our email for the week. We have 2 that came in, and the first one comes from listener Becky.
When Becky says, I just learned that a Salim is part human, part Jinn. Maybe that's why Salim can't let the Jinn go and why the Jinn lets him tag along. And that's from Becky.
So Becky's pointing out something that we saw earlier on. So if you remember, in the novel, basically the Jinn makes Salim a Jinn as well. I think that's how it goes. And the TV show decided to do it a little bit differently, where they kind of made them lovers and sort of motorcycle sidekicks. I'm not really sure. But it's a really good point in the sense that, I said earlier in the season that, Salim just needs to let it go. And that, he got his Dear John letter and just move on, dude. But Becky's pointing out here that maybe he can't let go because he is part Jinn as well. And so I totally forgot about his supernatural nature now. And I apologize, Becky. Great point. And our next email comes from Laura, and she's writing in about Zoria Vechernaya.
Okay, I guess the memorial for the Evening Star was more accurate than we all knew. Rest in peace, Cloris Leachman. And I have to tell you, this was like such weird timing, right, guys? Like, I mean, I totally agree with you, Laura. It was, just a couple weeks ago and then now in real life. And Cloris Leachman, I feel like is one of those actresses that's just like been around, my whole life that I've just seen pop up randomly in movies. And I just expect her to just randomly keep popping up in things. And it's pretty sad.
And again, the King Bee highlighted Cloris Leachman's acting credits throughout her life, from Malcolm in the Middle to Young Frankenstein. And if you find the time, guys, I think it's a fitting tribute to go and watch either of those. I'm more of a Young Frankenstein guy than a Malcolm in the Middle guy, but Malcolm in the Middle wasn't bad.
Same.
Well, thank you, Becky, and thank you, Laura, for writing in. Thank you, everyone, for listening. That concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV American Gods. We hope you enjoyed, and will join us next week for more. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, you can search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com. You can email us with your ideas at host@shatontv.com or call and leave us a voicemail at 914-719-SHAT. You can watch us live on Twitch at shatontv.com/Twitch. And also, do check out our sister podcast if you haven't already, Shat the Movies, where we join our good friend Big D, Dick Ebert, to cover 80s and 90s movies commissioned by you, the listeners. You can find past and future episodes at shatthemovies.com, wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe, and if you stop by iTunes, please leave a 5-star review. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash Lafley, Big D, Dick Ebert, and the King Bee, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us next week for Season 3, Episode 5 of American Gods, Sister Rising. And as always, stay the fuck at home.